Imagine this picture. Someone stepping out of the shadows in Petrograd, maybe wearing one of those long black leather coats, operating from an address like Gorkovaya 2, an address that just screams fear.
Yeah, that image, it really hits you, doesn't it? It's like a symbol.
Right.
The uniform, the infamous location. It instantly brings up the early Soviet state and, well, its muscle.
It really does.
Uh-huh.
So today we're really diving into the All-Russian Extraordinary Commission, probably better known and definitely more feared by its shorter name, the Cheka.
Mm-hmm. And we've got a whole stack of sources here. We're looking at, where it came from, how it ballooned so fast, what it actually did, and the kind of shadow it cast.
Exactly. That's our mission here, unpack all of that.
Yeah.
We want to get a real sense of what the Cheka was, how it clawed its way out of that revolutionary chaos, what its agents were up to day, and why it looms so large, historically speaking. Maybe even, right up to today.
We'll pull out the key stuff from these sources, try to piece together a clear picture.
Yeah. The first Soviet secret police, notorious really from the get-go for just immense power and, frankly, brutality.
So, okay, let's set that scene. Where does it actually start? Think late 1917.
Right after the October Revolution.
Exactly. The country is just absolute turmoil. The Bolsheviks have grabbed power, but, they're facing resistance everywhere. Counter-revolution, sabotage, just chaos.
It's hanging by a thread, really. And at first, dealing with all that resistance, it was kind of ad hoc, wasn't it? Like the Petrograd Military Revolutionary Committee.
Yeah, temporary bodies like that. But the Bolsheviks, they pretty quickly realized they needed something more permanent, more centralized, something with sharper teeth.
Makes sense.
So according to what we've read, December 20th, 1917, that's the date. The Council of People's Commissars, the Sodnorakam, the early government, they formally set up the Cheka.
The All-Russian Extraordinary Commission for Combating Counter-Revolution and Sabotage. Quite a mouthful.
It is. And they put Felix Dzerzhinsky, Iron Felix, they called him, in charge.
Okay, so the official job description, right there in the name, fight counter-revolutionaries and saboteurs.
That was the idea, yeah.
And initially, the sources seem to suggest it was aimed mainly at class enemies, like the bourgeoisie, the clergy.
That was definitely the initial framing.
Yeah.
But, that shifted fast.
How small was it at the very start?
Really small. Our sources say maybe 40 officials initially. 40.
Wow.
They had to rely on, small groups of soldiers, Red Guardsmen. And, yeah, that first HQ was Gorkovaya 2 in Petrograd. Later, they moved to the Lubyanka in Moscow.
And it wasn't the only group doing this kind of thing at first, right? I remember reading there was some overlap, maybe even tension.
Oh, yeah. Definitely overlap with that Petrograd Military Revolutionary Committee and another commission run by a guy named Bolshevik.
And attempts to control it.
Right. Groups like the left SRs, they tried. They wanted, some kind of judicial oversight or maybe even to get control themselves. But the Bolsheviks weren't having it. They resisted that.
What's really striking, then, is how it went from that contested, pretty small beginning to this massive, pervasive thing across the whole country.
Yeah, the speed of that growth is incredible.
So how did that happen? What was the catalyst for that kind of expansion?
Well, the backdrop is key.
Yeah.
The Civil War. That intensifying chaos was, you could say, the perfect breeding ground.
Okay.
Then in February 1918, Dzerzhinsky himself sends out this radio telegram, basically a call to arms, set up emergency commissions locally everywhere.
So decentralize the presence, but keep the control central.
Exactly, a network, and it just exploded. By August 1918, that's just a few months later, the sources say there were already 38 gubernia Chekas, provincial level.
38?
And by the end of that same year, 365 uyezd Chekas, district level.
Wow, that's exponential.
It really was. They built this national apparatus top to bottom, oblast, gubernia, ran, uyezd, volost, border security too. By 1921, estimates put the Cheka and his troops at 200,000 people.
200,000. And it wasn't just the geographic reach that expanded, was it? The actual mission. It changed fundamentally.
That's a really crucial point from the sources, yeah.
Yeah.
It stopped being just about counter-revolution and sabotage in that narrow sense.
It became a weapon against basically anyone opposing the Bolsheviks.
Pretty much. All political opponents.
Yeah.
The list of responsibilities just kept growing. Counterintelligence, making sure the Red Army stayed loyal.
Which meant dealing with mutinies, desertions. A huge problem.
Massive. Plus border protection, intelligence gathering, running the early gulag camps, forcing peasants to hand over grain.
The food requisitions, right?
Yeah, and putting down rebellions, workers, peasants. Lots of uprisings happening.
They even set up special units, didn't they? Like for railways and within the military itself.
Right, railway sections, military sections. That military part eventually became the special section, very powerful, focused entirely on loyalty inside the army.
So one thing that really jumps out from the sources is the nature of the Cheka's power. That name, Extraordinary Commission.
It really meant something. They had virtually unlimited authority.
Unlimited.
And, crucially, they could interpret that authority however they wanted, very broadly.
And the sources mentioned there weren't really any standard procedures, no rule book.
Not in any meaningful way.
Mm-hmm.
The justification was that the country was basically a war zone that allowed for this incredibly wide remit.
Which leads us directly to the Red Terror.
And this wasn't just rogue agents. This came from the top. Lenin himself directed the Cheka to carry out mass arrests, imprisonments, torture, and executions, explicitly without trial.
When did the Red Terror officially kick off?
Dzerzhinsky formally implemented it September 5th, 1918. The official reason given was, responding to threats like assassination attempts on Lenin and another leader, Uritsky.
But the reality was much broader.
Oh, much. There's this chilling quote the sources pull from Krasnaya Gazeta, a Red Army paper at the time. It says something like, "Without mercy, we will kill our enemies in scores of hundreds. Let them be thousands. Let them drown themselves in their own blood. For the blood of Lenin, let there be floods of blood of the bourgeoisie, more blood, as much as possible."
It's brutal. And these extreme methods, they weren't just isolated incidents.
No, they became baked into the system. Things like taking bourgeois hostages.
Explain that.
They'd round up people just based on their social class, hold them, and if there was any counter-revolutionary act, they just execute them in a reprisal. Summary execution.
And indiscriminate arrests were just normal.
It became routine. They even had these disguised trucks, Black Marias they called them, looked like delivery vans, used for secret arrests in the night.
God. And they developed specific techniques for killing.
Yeah, the sources described this in grim detail. They wanted something efficient, less messy, guaranteed death. So they came up with the Nakachis.
The shot to the back of the neck.
Exactly. Push the victim's head forward, fire down at point-blank range into the nape. Instant death. Minimal blood. Horrific. But it became the standard method for later agencies, too, like the NKVD.
Okay, so given all this, the unlimited power, the Red Terror, the systematic executions, the big question is the human cost. How many people did the Cheka actually kill?
And that is, well, it's hugely debated, very controversial. Getting precise numbers is incredibly hard.
What did the official figures say? The ones put out at the time?
The sources mention figures from Dzerzhinsky's deputy, a guy named Latsis. He claims something like 12,700 executions for the main Russian Republic, the RSFSR, between 1918 and 1920.
12,700, but...
But yeah, the sources are unanimous. Experts look at that number and say it's simply impossible, vastly understated. The real numbers were far, far higher.
So what are the estimates from scholars looking back?
They vary a lot, as you'd expect. Some estimates for executions range from, say, 50,000 up to maybe 200,000.
That's a huge range.
It is. Some scholars lean towards a higher end, maybe closer to 250,000.
Hmm?
Others suggest a lower range, maybe around 100,000 executions directly by the Cheka. It's tough to pin down.
And then there are broader figures for overall repression deaths during that period.
Right, which might include deaths in camps, during requisitions, fighting rebellions, things like that.
Huh.
Not just direct Cheka executions. Figures there go much higher. One estimate mentioned is around 1.2 million total repression deaths.
Hmm.
Another disputed figure goes over 1.7 million just for 1918-19. But again, scope matters there.
And disturbingly, the sources point to Lenin himself basically endorsing the scale of killing.
Yeah, there are quotes. In early 1920, he said something like, "We did not hesitate to shoot thousands of people, and we shall not hesitate. We shall save the country."
Chilling.
And later, in 21, the Politburo, with him chairing, actually voted to give the Cheka broader rights to use the death penalty.
It wasn't just executions, though. Torture was widespread.
The sources are very clear on that. It was common practice. And the descriptions are, well, they're horrific. Depending on the region, accounts mentioned skinning people alive, scalping,
Oh, God.
shrouding with barbed wire, impalement, crucifixions, being rolled naked in barrels studded with nails.
It's hard to even comprehend.
There's one specific example mentioned from Kyiv, involving a rat in a heated tube placed on a bound victim's stomach. The rat would gnaw through. Well, you get the idea.
Unbelievable. And this was public knowledge.
Shockingly, yes. The sources say accounts of these kinds of atrocities were actually published in Bolshevik newspapers at the time, like Pravda and Izvestia.
And it wasn't just political opponents or soldiers targeted, right? Women and children, too.
Tragically, yes.
Yeah.
Sources state women were sometimes tortured, raped, and shot. And children, kids as young as 8 up to maybe 13, were imprisoned, sometimes executed.
8 years old.
Yeah. And another major target group was Red Army deserters during the Civil War.
Because that undermined the whole war effort.
Exactly. The Chekas set up these special punitive departments just to deal with them. Hundreds of thousands were arrested in 1919, 1920 alone.
What happened to them?
Sometimes forced back to the front.
Yeah.
But also, hostage-taking was common, taking family members, sometimes shooting them, to force deserters back or just as punishment.
And they used terms like bandit pretty broadly, didn't they?
Very broadly. It could mean actual criminals, but also political enemies, rebels, anyone resisting. Yeah. It blurred the lines completely.
Okay, so the Cheka, that specific organization with that name, it didn't actually last forever. What happened? What's the legacy?
Right. It was formally dissolved in February 1922, replaced by the GPU, the State Political Directorate.
But was it really a replacement or more like a rebranding?
Pretty much the latter. The GPU just became a section within the NKVD, the People's Commissariat for Internal Affairs, and crucially, Nuzinski stayed in charge.
Ah, okay, so the leadership, the people, the methods, they largely carried over.
Essentially, yes. And that name, Chekist, it really stuck, didn't it?
That's what the sources say.
Absolutely. Throughout the entire Soviet period, no matter what the secret police was officially called GPU, NKVD, KGB people, colloquially called its members Chekists.
There's that mention from Solzhenitsyn.
Right, in the Gulag Archipelago, he talks about inmates using the term old Chekist, almost with like this dark respect for the really experienced, hardened camp administrators.
And that term is still around, even today.
You still hear it. Figures like Vladimir Putin, given his KGB background, are sometimes referred to as a Chekist in Russian media. It highlights that long line, that continuity in the security services.
What about the agents themselves doing that kind of work? It must have had an impact.
Oh, undoubtedly. The sources mention Nikolai Bukharin commenting that psychopathic disorders were basically an occupational hazard.
I can imagine. How did they cope?
Reports mention heavy drinking, drug use, and they developed their own slang, like calling executions shooting partridges. Probably a way to, psychologically distance themselves.
And the Cheka's influence spread beyond Russia, too.
Yeah, its legacy popped up elsewhere. There's a film called The Chekist that tried to portray the brutality. And during the Spanish Civil War, Republican detention centers known for torture were actually called Chekas, directly named after the Soviet original, copying its methods.
But maybe the most controversial part of the legacy today
Is the holiday.
Yeah.
The sources point this out very clearly. The professional holiday for Russia's current security services, the FSB and others, it's still celebrated on December 20th.
The anniversary of the Cheka's founding.
Exactly. And that draws a lot of criticism. People compare it to, say, Germany celebrating Gestapo Day.
The implication being
that the successor agencies haven't fully broken from the methods or the mindset of the original Cheka, an organization defined by that unchecked power, that brutality, responsible for maybe hundreds of thousands of deaths. Celebrating his birthday sends a pretty strong signal.
So, summing up then, the Cheka starts in that post-revolution chaos, narrow mission initially.
But under Dzerzhinsky and Lenin, it just explodes. Power, scope, becomes this pervasive machine of repression against anyone seen as an enemy.
Operating with basically zero limits outside the law.
Driving the Red Terror, mass arrests, systematic torture, huge numbers of executions way beyond official figures, horrific brutality against men, women, even kids.
And even though the name Cheka disappears,
the methods, the personnel, the idea of the Chekist, it all carries through the Soviet era, and that legacy echoes right up to today, even marked on the calendar.
Which leaves us with something to really chew on. Think about what it means when an organization like the Cheka, born in violence, defined by unlimited power and brutality, when its founding day is still the official professional holiday for a nation's security services. What does that continuity tell you about the relationship between state power and the people it governs? Definitely something worth thinking about.